Stoic history for sleep. How ancient philosophers used silence as a superpower. Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a world where silence wasn't just golden, it was powerful. Imagine yourself in ancient Rome, surrounded by bustling markets, heated debates in the forum, and political intrigue brewing behind closed doors. Amid the noise, the Stoics practiced something radically different: strategic silence. It's easy to overlook the power of saying nothing in a world that glorifies constant speech. But for Stoic philosophers, silence wasn't just about avoiding unnecessary chatter. It was a tool of self-discipline, wisdom, and sometimes survival. You probably wouldn't survive a debate with a master Stoic, not because they'd out-argue you, but because they wouldn't argue at all. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know your location and local time in the comments. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture Zeno of Citium, the founder of Stoicism, standing quietly in the Athenian agora. He wasn't a man of long-winded speeches, but when he did speak, people listened. His philosophy emphasized virtue discipline and emotional control principles that demanded reflection and restraint. He taught his students that wisdom wasn't found in endless debate, but in thoughtful, measured words. Historians still argue whether Zeno's quiet demeanor was simply his personality or a deliberate philosophical stance. Some records suggest he was naturally reserved, while others claim his silence was a form of training, a way to cultivate patience and avoid the impulsivity of reactive speech. Beyond Zeno's, silence remained a vital part of Stoic life. It was a way to resist external chaos, a method to process emotions without being overwhelmed. In a world where voices were constantly clashing, whether in political arguments or gladiator cheers, choosing silence was an act of defiance. And yet silence didn't mean disengagement. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor, used silence not as a retreat, but as a tool for self-reflection. His journal, Meditations, was written entirely for himself, never intended for public eyes. In those pages, he explored ideas that remain just as relevant today: how to find peace amid responsibility, how to endure hardships with dignity, and how to respond to people's cruelty with quiet strength. Stoicism taught that silence could be more persuasive than speech. In heated arguments, the ability to hold back words, to pause, to remain composed, these were marks of true mastery. And sometimes saying nothing carried more meaning than any elaborate response. Whether it was Zeno's quiet revolution or Marcus Aurelius's tarry reflections, the Stoics understood one crucial truth: silence used well was a kind of wisdom. And as we move forward, we'll see exactly how they wielded this quiet power. Zeno of Citium was not a man of excess words. In a time when philosophers often delivered grand speeches and engaged in sharp debates, Zeno stood apart, not for how much he said, but for how little. Picture him in Athens, standing under a colonnade, his students gathered around him. He listens more than he speaks, carefully, choosing each word. When he does respond, his sentences are short, sometimes just a few words. It wasn't that he lacked ideas. Far from it. He simply believed that wisdom wasn't measured by how much one spoke, but by how well one understood. Historians still argue whether Zeno's silence was natural or intentional. Some accounts describe him as reserved a man who naturally preferred contemplation over conversation. Others suggest that his quiet demeanor was a deliberate practice, an effort to train himself in restraint, a way to embody the Stoic ideal of self-control. Zeno's philosophy emphasized simplicity, discipline, and virtue. And silence, as it turned out, was woven into all three. To be silent was to resist the temptation of idle chatter, to avoid the pitfalls of reactive speech, to ensure that every word served a purpose. This wasn't just about sounding wise, it was about cultivating an inner strength. The ability to hold back words, to pause before speaking, to listen more than talk. These were marks of a Stoic mind. To Zeno, silence wasn't a sign of ignorance, but of intelligence. He taught his students that speaking should never be impulsive. Instead, words should be measured, deliberate, even rare. A person who spoke too much risked revealing their ignorance. A person who mastered silence signaled control. There was also a practical side to this philosophy. In ancient Athens, where debates could turn heated and political tensions ran high, silence was sometimes a survival strategy. A philosopher who spoke carelessly could anger the wrong people, attract the wrong attention. Zeno understood this well. By choosing his words carefully and limiting how much he spoke, he ensured that his teachings endured without unnecessary conflicts. But Zeno's influence extended beyond philosophy. His students carried his ideas forward, spreading Stoicism throughout the Roman world. And even as Stoicism evolved, silence remained a cornerstone of its practice. From the quiet strength of Zeno to the later reflections of Marcus Aurelius, the Stoics believed that silence was not an absence of speech, but a presence of wisdom. And as we move forward, we'll see how other philosophers wielded this quiet power. Marcus Aurelius, Rome's philosopher-emperor, knew the value of silence better than most. In the chaos of ruling an empire, where decisions could mean life or death, Aurelius found solace in quiet reflection. Imagine him late at night, the city beyond his palace walls, humming with distant voices. The Senate debated the streets, buzzed with merchants, and soldiers murmured in their barracks. Yet at the heart of Rome's power, Marcus Aurelius sat alone, writing in the flickering candlelight. His journal. Meditations wasn't meant for public eyes. It was a conversation with himself, an attempt to shape his thoughts in silence before shaping the world with his actions. Stoicism taught that silence was a tool, and Aurelius wielded it with precision. While other emperors surrounded themselves with advisors, eager to hear words of flattery and strategy, Aurelius knew the importance of listening not just to others, but to himself. One mainstream fact about his writings: they were never intended for publication. Unlike philosophical treatises meant to educate, Meditations was deeply personal, a collection of reflections, reminders, and quiet debates that allowed Aurelius to process the burden of power. His approach to rule was marked by a kind of detached serenity. When confronted with criticism, he did not rush to defend himself. When faced with conflict, he paused before responding. Historians still argue whether his restraint was a sign of wisdom or the exhaustion of a ruler burdened by endless responsibility. But silence wasn't just for contemplation. It was also a defense against the emotional turmoil of leadership. Aurelius had seen how words could ignite conflict, how impulsive declarations could lead to unnecessary wars, how personal grievances could turn into political disasters. One quirky tidbit: Aurelius had a habit of taking long, solitary walks through the palace gardens, sometimes in the rain, simply listening to the world around him. To outsiders, it may have seemed like an idle pastime, but for a Stoic, these quiet moments were essential. His journals reveal a man who constantly reminded himself to accept fate to control only what was within his power, to maintain dignity in adversity. And above all, to remain silent when silence was the wiser path. Through Aurelius, the idea of silent reflection became an essential part of Stoic practice. It wasn't just about avoiding unnecessary words, it was about cultivating an inner space for clarity, a refuge from the noise of life. And as we continue, we'll see how Stoicism extended this principle beyond personal reflection into everyday interactions, even in the face of insult and conflict. You've probably been in a situation where someone hurls an insult your way, expecting a reaction. Maybe it's a snide remark from a coworker, a rude comment online, or an unnecessary jab from a relative. Your instinct is to fire back, defend yourself, prove your point. But the Stoics had a different approach. Imagine you're walking through the crowded streets of Rome, past market stalls and echoing voices. A philosopher sits nearby, cross-legged and calm, while a group gathers to heckle him. They call him useless, weak, ridiculous. And yet he doesn't respond. He barely even acknowledges them. He simply listens, maybe nods, maybe smiles, but says nothing. That was the Stoic way. Epictetus, one of the most influential Stoic teachers, famously instructed his students to react to insults with silence, or at most, a knowing smile. The logic was simple. Anger is a choice, and words have power only if you grant them significance. One mainstream fact: Epictetus himself had endured plenty of cruelty. Born a slave, he had seen the worst of human behavior. Yet instead of retaliating, he learned patience. Silence wasn't just passive. It was a strategy, a measured non-response, often frustrated aggressors more than any retort. Imagine berating someone only for them to shrug and move on. Suddenly, your words feel meaningless. This philosophy extended into daily Stoic practice. One quirky tidbit: some Stoics even practiced silent meals, where they ate in total quiet to cultivate mindfulness and self-restraint. For them, even the simplest interactions were training grounds for discipline. Historians still debate whether this approach was practical in all situations. Could silence diffuse every conflict? Was it always wise to hold back instead of speaking up? There were times when Stoics engaged in discourse, moments when words were necessary. But when faced with hostility, they leaned toward quiet strength. The ability to remain calm, to resist impulsive speech, to master silence. These weren't just philosophical exercises. They were shields against the chaos of the world. And as we move forward, we'll see how silence wasn't only a defense. It was sometimes a dangerous, risky act in the political landscape of Rome. Silence, when used skillfully, could be a powerful tool, but in ancient Rome, it could also be dangerous. Imagine standing before a Roman senator accused of treason while the entire court waits for your defense. Do you speak in your own favor, risking further accusations? Or do you remain silent, knowing that silence itself might be interpreted as defiance? In an empire where political survival often depended on rhetoric, choosing silence wasn't always wise. And yet some philosophers mastered the art of shutting up, not just as a personal practice, but as a form of self-preservation. Take Seneca, for example. As an advisor to Emperor Nero, he knew that words could easily become weapons. Rome was a city of intrigue, where shifting loyalties and whispered betrayals could end careers or lives. One mainstream fact: Seneca's relationship with Nero was a precarious one, and his ability to stay measured, reserved, and quiet helped him navigate the dangers of court life for years. But Stoics didn't just use silence for survival. They wielded it as persuasion. In debates, they sometimes refused to engage in fruitless arguments, letting the lack of response speak louder than any counterpoint. One quirky tidbit: the Stoic philosopher Agrippinus was famous for refusing to plead his case when accused of crimes he hadn't committed. When asked why he wouldn't argue for his innocence, he simply shrugged and said, "I don't want to be like them." His silence was an act of defiance. Historians still debate whether silence in Rome was truly a sign of wisdom or merely a necessity born of political danger. In some cases, saying nothing allowed a philosopher to avoid unnecessary conflict. In others, silence itself became a statement, one that carried more weight than any speech. But regardless of its risks, Stoic silence endured as a practice passed down through centuries. And as we turn to modern times, we'll see how this ancient wisdom still applies, perhaps now more than ever. You live in a world where silence is rare. Notifications buzz, conversations overlap, and the pressure to speak, to respond, to react, to prove your presence feels constant. But the Stoics understood something that might still apply today. Silence is a choice, and choosing it can be powerful. Imagine stepping away from the noise, not permanently, but intentionally. You close the app before responding to a heated comment. You resist the urge to jump into an argument that won't change minds. You pause before answering a question, giving yourself time to think. These might seem like small actions, but for the Stoics, these moments were part of a larger discipline. Silence wasn't about disengagement, it was about control. They believed that reacting impulsively without reflection was a sign of weakness. True mastery came from the ability to hold back when necessary. One mainstream fact: ancient Stoics didn't just teach this principle, they lived it. Musonius Rufus, one of the lesser-known Stoic philosophers, trained his students in restraint by instructing them to practice long stretches of silence. He argued that just as physical training built strength, silence built mental discipline. One quirky tidbit: some Stoics even refrained from speech for an entire day each week, treating it as an exercise in patience and observation. But historians still debate how much of ancient Stoic silence was truly about self-control versus sheer necessity. In an era where public words could lead to exile, or worse, silence wasn't always a voluntary practice. Sometimes it was a survival strategy. And yet, despite how times have changed, the Stoic approach remains relevant. In today's fast-paced world, choosing quiet moments might be harder than ever. But maybe, just maybe, there's wisdom in stepping back from the noise. You don't have to renounce speech entirely, but in moments of chaos, in moments of frustration, in moments of impulse, you can choose silence. And in that silence, you just might find a little clarity. The room feels quieter now. The thoughts settle, the words slow down, and there's no rush to respond to anything. You've traveled through ancient Rome, walked alongside philosophers, and seen how silence shaped lives and decisions. But now there's nothing left to say, just a quiet breath in and an even slower breath out. The Stoics didn't demand silence from others. They simply knew when to choose it for themselves. Maybe that's something worth remembering. Let everything fade. The voices in your mind, the lingering thoughts about the day, just let them drift away like ancient whispers lost to time. It's okay to be still. It's okay to rest. Sleep well, my friend. Sweet dreams.